Hi everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on Portland's Restorative Justice and Preference Policy. My name is Caitlin Snyder, and I'm a Policy and Research Associate here at the National Housing Conference. Also joining me is...
I'm Chris Estes. I'm the President and CEO of the National Housing Conference. NHC is a national organization that works to bring the housing community together to cultivate and advance best practices, share ideas, and objectively advocate for effective affordable housing policy. We also work to distill the latest research on housing issues and provide the housing and community development community with the tools they need to communicate effectively and to address America's affordable housing needs. This issue in particular that we're going to talk about today is something that NHC has been thinking and talking about for some time. I think the challenges that we have been in our work have been dealing with over how to think about place-based and mobility efforts, the implementation of the affirmatively furthering for housing rule, the efforts to deconcentrate poverty have been sort of long-standing issues that seem to be coming to a head in some ways, and particularly are challenged by the change in sort of the framework we've had around concentrated poverty in cities, that many of our central core cities are now gentrifying and seeing population increases, both in a diversity of income and ethnic makeup than those neighborhoods had seen before, and it placed real challenges on sort of how we balance the desire to deconcentrate poverty versus protect long-standing communities and allow them to participate in that sort of beneficial gentrification that their communities may be experiencing. For that reason, we were particularly excited to have the opportunity to work with the Open Society Foundation in the formation of the Inclusive Communities Group, and I will turn it over to Caitlin to give you some more details about that effort.
Thanks, Chris. So NHC first learned about Portland's Restorative Justice and Preference Policy through our Inclusive Communities Working Group, which, as he mentioned, is sponsored by the Open Society Foundation. Our working group brings together housing leaders from places of high and rising housing costs to ensure that communities can remain inclusive of everyone. And so on the slide, you're seeing a map of the different localities that are represented in the group, and one of our recent research publications that came from the group. And so Kurt Krieger is the director of the Portland Housing Bureau and represents the city of Portland in our working group. And he brought this to us, and we thought it was really worth sharing with a larger audience. And Kurt will kick us off in just a few minutes. I want to take a minute now to introduce our other panelists. So we've got Dr. Lisa Bates, who's an associate professor of urban studies and planning at Portland State University, Kurt Krieger, who I've already mentioned, Bishop Stephen Holt, who's a pastor at Kingdom Nation Church, Victoria James, who's a housing policy analyst at the Portland Housing Bureau, and finally Matthew Schaubold, who's the equity and policy manager at Portland Housing Bureau. And before we get started, I just have a few technical notes. So this webinar is being recorded, and an archived copy will be made available on NHC's website, and we'll also send a link out to everyone who's registered once the recording is online. Please note that all participant lines are muted to ensure clear sound quality for everyone. We'll be taking questions through the GoToWebinar control panel. If you have a question at any time during the webinar, please submit it through the question box, which is outlined in red. And we'll try to answer as many of your questions as possible at the end of the webinar. And while we hope this webinar runs smoothly for everyone, we know that this doesn't always happen. If you run into any technical difficulties during the webinar, please use the Help menu at the top of the GoToWebinar control panel. And if that doesn't work, you can visit the website that we've listed on the screen, the support.citrixonline.com. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Portland.
This is Kurt Krieger, the director of the Portland Housing Bureau. I'm going to provide a general framework, and then Lisa Bates will do a deeper dive into North and Northeast Portland and the effects of gentrification. But by way of introduction, the city of Portland is about 620,000 population. It is, of course, the largest city in Oregon, and it is governed by a 5-member City Council. It's important that you know that they are nonpartisan and they are elected at large. So as policy issues come to council, we don't have what you would often find in other jurisdictions, either partisan issues or district issues. We have 5 individuals that take a larger view about the whole health of the city. We have a mayoral form of government whereby the mayor assigns responsibility for each of the various bureaus, of which there are 21, to different city commissioners. So each city commissioner has both legislative and administrative control over aspects of the city. So I report to a city commissioner who has hiring and firing authority over me, and I then have latitude in running the Housing Bureau. The Housing Bureau is the recipient of all federal funds related to housing, including home and CDBG. We prepare the consolidated plan for the region. We prepare the fair housing plan for the region. And we are principally a funder of affordable housing through a network of nonprofits and mission-driven for-profit entities. Our portfolio is about 13,560 units. Our annual budget is $153 million, most of which is equity and subordinated debt for specific projects. So Portland is experiencing a housing emergency. In 2015, the City Council, at the direction of Mayor Hales, enacted a state of housing and homeless emergency that has just been extended for a further year. The quality of life in Portland and the economic growth of the area has placed very strong pressures on all incomes, but principally low and moderate income households. About 130 people move to Portland every day, and our vacancy rates in the affordable stock ranges between 2 and 3%. So we have in-migration, we have lots of housing pressure. Year over year, we've exceeded average rent increases of double digits, as well as home price increases. So, you know, we've been tracking with Seattle and Denver as the highest cost inflation markets. That has gone unabated. We don't see that changing anytime soon, because most of the product that is being built by the private sector in this marketplace is a luxury housing product. Our median rent is about $2,000 per unit per month in the new product. We do track housing affordability by neighborhood through a state of housing. It's on our website. It will be updated again in December. And you will find that people who have incomes under 80% of median income, in large part, cannot live in the central city nor in the close-in neighborhoods. They are increasingly pushed to the suburban fringe. And it is worth mentioning that we share a border with Washington State, so we're not just pushing people to the suburbs, we're pushing people to another state in the case of Washington State. I think that's a good sort of general background as to where we are politically, as well as a general overview of the housing market, and I'll let Lisa Bates talk a little bit more about North and Northeast Portland in particular.
Great, thank you. I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of the policymaking history and track that we took to get to where we are now with drilling down into the preference policy. So this entire work around gentrification and displacement leading into the preference policy really emerges out of the 2012 Portland Plan. The Portland Plan was a 3-year-long process of making a strategic plan for the city. And recognizing, you know, some of these rising inequalities that Kurt just mentioned, particularly for communities of color in Portland who are worse off than the national average on many indicators. There was a tremendous amount of organizing and work to recognize that Portland cannot continue to grow and thrive if it did not place closing gaps, particularly again for people of color, at the heart of its strategies for moving forward. And so the Portland Plan was adopted with equity as the guiding principle, and specifically a racial justice lens adopted as part of that. One of the issues that community brought forward during that process was gentrification. And moving out of the Portland plan, there was a desire, and I worked from PSU with the City of Portland Bureau of Planning and Sustainability to develop a report and mapping strategy for thinking about gentrification in a more pragmatic way. We were really stuck in a space which I think is pretty common around cities in the country right now, of arguing about whether gentrification was good or not good, and recognizing that we all want to see revitalization and investment and improvements made to low-income neighborhoods. What we chose to do was really focus on the negative effect that displacement of particularly low-income people, renters, and people of color from these neighborhoods as they gain these new amenities, new services, new economic opportunities was really what we needed to be concerned about. We didn't want to argue about the upside. We wanted to really focus on the downside and create that as a shared understanding that we needed to move forward to think more effectively about how public investments could affect the potential for residential displacement, and created a strategy guide that linked up types of policies to the stage that a neighborhood was in terms of gentrification potential or actually having ongoing active displacement of low-income people. And you can see the map here that was built out. So just to give you a sense of where we're talking about, primarily this presentation is about the hot pink area that's sort of in the center, what we call Northeast Portland, the Albina district. And then you'll see this hashed area out to East Portland. That gray hash area are primarily places where people who have been displaced are moving to. Those are our lowest income parts of the city, and where increasingly communities of color are being concentrated as they are being priced out of the central city. To be honest, not a tremendous amount was happening with this policymaking strategy until we started really seeing this unbelievable rebound in the housing market and the crisis that came along with it. Not only these massive growth, the building of luxury housing, the increase in homelessness, particularly for African Americans, but also a continuation of practices to invest in sort of high-end and subsidized market construction and redevelopment in Northeast Portland, an area where the real estate market was already very, very hot. And we saw a lot of community opposition coming forward, protesting subsidized placement of sort of high-end grocery chain, and trying to have an impact on our comprehensive land use plan. So community was really pushing to develop anti-displacement policies, and the preference policy emerged as part of a commitment of the city to increase its investment in housing, affordable housing, through increased allocation of urban renewal funds to the Housing Bureau, away from economic development activities into affordable housing activities in this area of the city, Northeast Portland, which you would have seen in that hot pink, high gentrification area on the previous map. We definitely view the housing preference policy as part of the affirmatively furthering fair housing commitment to ensure that those who have a historical tie in the neighborhood, who are largely Black, have access to the opportunities as the neighborhood has been revitalized. So just to give a sense of some of the history, Portland has a pretty small Black population, but until recently, almost the entire African American community lived in Northeast Portland. It was the area that immediately post-World War II was sort of designated by realtors and city leaders as the place that Black people could live. And over the past 70 years, there have been repeat actions of urban renewal in these areas. So just like I think most cities in America, there was a major significant highway construction. There was a large condemnation action to build a sports coliseum in the Rose Garden Sports Arena area, and to build a hospital expansion in this close-in urban neighborhood. there are many Black families in Portland who are experiencing up to now a fourth generation of displacement, involuntary displacement in and out of this Northeast Portland area, from everything from natural disaster to highway construction to the newest urban renewal area created in 2000, that has brought in a massive influx of market activity and renewed sort of displacement through the construction of high-end luxury housing and increased economic activity. And you can see here that the areas on the left, which are urban renewal areas, now correspond very heavily with what we consider our high opportunity areas. So we really recognize that as folks are displaced from those areas, which in the past were considered blighted, they are losing their access to the kinds of opportunities that we want to have people connected to. So we're really trying to create policy to address those inequalities and try to understand the consequences of not only today's urban renewal practices, but thinking back through this historical state. And so that's sort of what led into this community and city collaboration to actually develop a policy that would allow the acknowledgement of that history.
So this is Matthew Schaubold, and I'm going to talk through a little bit of the development of the policy itself. And I think it's important to note that the North-Northeast housing preference policy is one element of a larger North-Northeast housing strategy that was developed in partnership with the community as a result of some significant concern about city actions in North and Northeast Portland associated with urban renewal. And so that really was one of the key drivers to, as Lisa mentioned, reallocate a significant portion of the urban renewal resources toward affordable housing, and for then the Housing Bureau itself to develop a larger housing strategy for North and Northeast Portland. And so as we undertook the development of the preference policy itself, we pulled together a work group of city staff as well as leaders and members of the North-Northeast community, both present and from the past that had already been displaced or who had their families displaced in a previous generation, to identify what the goal of a preference policy should be in the context, again, specifically in the context of the city's North-Northeast housing strategy. And so we developed the 4 goals that you see on the screen in front of you, and I just would like to take some time and walk through the process by which we how we tackled each of the 4 goals and integrated them into the policy itself. So the first goal was that the city would, in its programming for rental housing and home ownership programs, give preference to applicants based on the amount of urban renewal activity that occurred where their family actually lived. And so the city undertook a process of really taking a hard look at its history and identifying what were the historic urban renewal actions, whether explicitly called urban renewal or implicitly the actions were urban renewal that displaced families, to try and get a sense of what that concentration of urban renewal looked like. And so the areas that we found, the actions that we found were already touched on by Lisa, but just very briefly, in the 1950s and 1970s, there was a flurry of condemnation actions and eminent domain actions that had people's property taken or condemned by the city or by the tax assessor, and they were concentrated in the area that you see highlighted in the orange on the map in front of you. In the 1990s, the city worked in partnership with members of the community to develop what was known as the Albina Community Plan. And the unfortunate part about the Albina Community Plan was the implementation of it was poor, and many of the actions that were identified by community members and community leaders that would mitigate the negative impacts of the urban renewal style actions that were also part of the plan were ignored or were not capitalized. And so what you saw were a number of the actions in the plan itself that led to displacement implemented, and a number, if not all of those that would have prevented displacement, either not implemented or poorly capitalized, and that's the boundary you see in front of you. And then finally, in the year 2000, the city established an urban renewal area, which you see the chaotic boundary in front of you on the screen, in which it was primarily at the time focused on the development of a light rail line for mass transit into North and Northeast Portland, but it was also associated with a significant level of funding to invest in infrastructure development that led to the displacement of vulnerable households. And so and specifically also some public housing located at Columbia Villa. And so what we did is we mapped those three boundaries of actions on top of each other to get a sense of the concentration and the density of those activities by geography, and then we looked at assigning point values for each of the areas with an understanding that if a family at some point in the past anywhere between 10 and 60 years lived in a particular block or a particular area zone of the map, they would have likely experienced not only a significantly higher level of urban renewal activities, but it would have occurred generationally. So the second goal of the policy was to tackle the generational displacement of families by urban renewal. So what the city chose to do was, in the structure of its point system, was to allow for 0 to 3 points for the household who was applying it themselves, and then allowing for 0 to 3 points of preference for a household's ancestors. And so we defined ancestors by parent, grandparent, or guardian. And so if an applicant was able to demonstrate that a parent, grandparent, or guardian also had lived in one of the areas in the 0, 1, 2, or 3 point level of urban renewal, that those points would layer into their own application as they applied for our programming. The third goal was to give preference to families regardless of where they currently live. And while this is simply accomplished through allowing families to use whatever address they choose, this was a pretty big topic of discussion of our work group that we pulled together of city staff and community members. And it really was with respect to what is the virtue of the preference policy, and is it a path for a right to return for community members who have been displaced, or is it a chance to not only bring folks back who've been displaced, but also help prevent displacement for people who are living on the edge of housing affordability in the neighborhood as we experience the rapid change. And in the end, the work group felt most comfortable with saying that they wanted to be able to provide the opportunity to give preference for folks who had already been displaced, as well as those who may still be in the neighborhood, but their income situation, as well as the historic generational impacts of urban renewal, were putting them on the edge. And then finally, the fourth goal was to give top priorities to families who had property taken by the city. And so the city does have a tragic history of taking a significant number of homes and a significant amount of property, in fact also a significant number of businesses from the residents of North and Northeast Portland through this history of urban renewal in the area and all the actions that had taken place. And so we had some staff do research and pull the names of folks from city records and from other records that could be verified for all of the major actions, whether it was as a part of the Albina Community Plan, the development of the Memorial Coliseum, which is the local sports arena, or used to be the local sports arena, as well as the development of what was then called Emmanuel Hospital, where homes were taken to clear land for the development of the hospital. And so as we pulled those names together, we said that if there was an applicant that was a direct descendant of somebody who had their property taken, that they did not need to rate on the 0 to 6 point scale, but rather they would move straight to the top of the list. And the city also acknowledged that our records are imperfect, and that if someone were able to demonstrate that they were a descendant of somebody who had their property taken, who was not on one of these incomplete lists, that we would case manage those individually in partnership with the applicant, in order to make sure that they were in the proper slot in the ranking list for access to our program. And so in the end, what we ended up with was a structure of a policy where we were ordering wait lists for our, again, rental housing, rental affordable housing, as well as home ownership programs, based on the amount of urban renewal that families experienced across generations, and with a particular focus on prioritizing those who had had their property taken by the city itself.
All right. Hi, I'm Victoria James, working as a housing policy analyst here at Portland Housing Bureau, and I'm going to take you through the outreach and implementation strategies that we used for the preference policy. So we'll be talking about how we created an accessible applicant process, how we engaged the community with outreach and up sort of the accessibility of that, how we affirmatively marketed the preference policy, and then the procedures we used for application intake as well as waitlist management. And we'll end by talking a little bit about the housing opportunities offered through this first rollout of the preference policy by talking a little bit about the nonprofit homeownership providers that we're working with. So when we talk about making an accessible application process, we're really talking about two things. On the one hand, we're talking about how can we streamline the application process for the applicant to make that sort of as painless as possible. On the other hand, we're talking about how can we as government be transparent and accountable in the program that we're rolling out. So at a high level, when we talk about the applicant's process, really they're applying for housing opportunities through the preference policy, so that's the first application. Then Portland Housing Bureau is going through and verifying the information that an applicant gave us on that application. And then we are linking eligible applicants with our nonprofit housing providers. So for applicants, we provide ongoing phone, mail, and email support to help answer any questions, but also to remind applicants of various deadlines that are coming up, as well as information sessions that they need to attend. We also have a grievance process, so in case an applicant feels any sort of conflict or is having trouble throughout our process, they can feel supported and we can be held accountable for whatever their issue may be. Sort of from a transparency and accountability side, we really wanted to make sure that all of our outreach was culturally specific, language specific, geographically specific. We also wanted to make sure that all of the partners and internal staff that we were working with were all completely informed and on the same page about what this process was, so that we could have a unified message going out, throughout government, but also back into the community. And one of the biggest areas of transparency was that we set up an oversight committee, and that's part of the larger North-Northeast housing strategy. Basically, that oversight committee is around 10 members whose job it is to help advise us on the programming that we're releasing in that area, but also to review and monitor sort of the outputs of the programming in that area. And those members have expertise in a variety of areas, included but not limited to policy and planning, development and construction, contracting, banking. There are obviously representatives from the North and Northeast on that panel as well. So talking a little bit more about community access and outreach. We offered our application for 2 weeks, and we offered it online, and it was mobile friendly, but also in paper. And one thing that we thought was really important was to have designated application sites where an applicant could not only fill out the application, but have somebody there with them one-on-one, helping them through any problems that they might have. As Matthew showed you before, the areas that we're looking at to give applicants preference are a little bit difficult to sort of look at and to figure out what kind of preference you would get. So we definitely had trained personnel at all of those sites. We had 12 designated application sites, which you can see on the map in both red and green. We also contacted a variety of, again, those language, geographically specific organizations, and we really wanted to just get the word out to pretty much any place that people would congregate. So that includes schools, community centers, libraries, religious institutions. All those places are in both the pink and the blue on that map. As far as marketing, we had 3 main goals for that. First, we wanted to reach as broad a geography as we could, and that was in recognition that the applicant base that we wanted for this program were not only still in North and Northeast Portland, but had already been displaced outside of North and Northeast Portland. So we reached all the way to the city of Hillsborough to the west and to Gresham in the east, as well as sort of all areas of Portland. Our second goal was that we wanted to reach out to community-based organizations so that members of the community had additional support and access to the programming that we wanted to offer so that they could have reduced barriers in applying. And thirdly, we wanted to make sure that our marketing was as inclusive as possible so that we could directly engage with members of the community that might have otherwise been sort of outside of receiving that marketing, so that we could educate and inform the largest possible applicant base for this program. And our marketing, just on a high level, included radio, newspaper, online ads, and then we also did some email blasts to various people who would have been on the North and Northeast Neighborhood Strategy email list for having attended forums or otherwise. And application was made available 2 weeks in advance of the actual window so that families could start to look at the map and figure out sort of what their eligibility would be when that application window opened. So now we're going to talk about application intake and waitlist management. For those of you who are listening in from housing authorities, the waitlist process is going to sound familiar. For the rest of us, essentially what happens is that all the applications are gathered into our system. Applicants are then sorted by self-reported preference points. Applicants are randomized within their point cohorts, and we form the waitlist from that. Applicants are verified by PHB, and then the waitlist is updated as soon as new information rolls in. So meaning once our staff go through and look at the addresses, if the amount of points reported and what we're actually seeing don't mesh, then the applicant will be sort of resorted into the waitlist in the cohort that they're actually eligible for. As far as verifying applicant information, we're really looking to see the ID matches, that the income is correct, that the applicants, the addresses that they're claiming can be associated with them or their ancestor. And then, as Matt mentioned, for the eminent domain applicants, we have another sort of layer of verification, and that is just making sure that the address that they're claiming really is in an area where eminent domain actions took place, as well as whatever the applicant's relation is to the address holder that they're claiming for that point. And lastly, for this round of preference policy, we're talking about homeownership opportunities. And sort of the work is divided between the Portland Housing Bureau and the nonprofits that we are working with. So it was really the Portland Housing Bureau's job to bring the largest amount of applicants we could in the door and create a wait list of those applicants, and then to send eligible applicants to our nonprofit providers who would then work with those applicants in a case management style to get those people into their housing opportunities within a set amount of time. Specifically, we're working with the African American Alliance for Home Ownership Collaborative, which is a set of various culturally specific and otherwise nonprofits, as well as the Portland Community Reinvestment Initiative. And between those two, they're offering 4 different homeownership models, anywhere from down payment assistance to land trust. And there was funding in this round for 65 households to get aid with homeownership opportunities, as well as 12 micro condominiums that came online in the middle of our process, which we decided to include in our process.
So what I'd like to do is talk a little bit more about the flow of funds. Because as you've heard, the city is owning the effect of its previous policy decisions, which had enormous unintended consequences and some intended consequences with perhaps short-term thinking. So what difference will we make going forward? In 2014, Mayor Charlie Hales earmarked $20 million to help activate the North-Northeast housing strategy. In 2015, the City Council recalibrated the amount of tax increment financing in each of the urban renewal areas, including the North Interstate urban renewal area, whereby 45% of that money will go into housing. That amounts to about $30 million in the TIF lift. So in short, between 2014 and 2020, there's about $15 million of new resources available to the community. But we wanted to make sure that there was a community-based fiduciary oversight in this allocation of funds. So Bishop Stephen Holt chairs the North and Northeast Oversight Committee. He's appointed by Commissioner Dan Salzman to that function, and they were not only involved in the development of the policy, but they also vet the allocation of funds for specific projects. So Bishop Holt is here to say a few remarks before we go into the questions.
So as the chair of the Oversight Committee, our responsibility primary is to make sure that the promises that have been made are the promises that are kept. So we review and assess and are engaged in any dollars that are being spent through monies allocated for people returning to and or development within the within the interstate urban renewal area. We are comprised of a group of individuals who are from banking, from education, from community members and so forth, and everyone commits their time to keep us on task and to help the efficiency of what is done with the city. And so far, I would say that I think we're on a good track with some of the proposed work and the units that are being developed and the process, which has been, as you've heard, very extensive to get us to this point. I'm looking forward to what we can accomplish, and I think we've got a good team at work.
So we've got some questions coming in, and so I'm going to go ahead and read the questions aloud, and then one of us or several of us will go ahead and do our best to answer. So the first question is, I noticed that AFFH was cited in the preference approach, which I think is great. My fear, however, is I'm seeing fair housing lawyers argue these preferences violate the new AFFH. Have you received a HUD opinion or a legal opinion that this will not be challenged? And I'll go ahead and answer that one first, which is with respect to the, we did not request nor have we received a HUD opinion, but we did, so there were representatives from our city attorney's office through the entirety of the process that were members of the work group that developed the preference policy and have worked with us on implementation to ensure that the North-Northeast housing strategy generally and the preference policy specifically was in full compliance of the law.
And I think it's important to underscore that this is a policy that is both colorblind and race neutral in its administration. And because we're dealing with specific harm that was inflicted on households in specific geographies, the actions are tied to legislative and policy actions of the Portland City Council specifically. So it is different from what is being attempted in New York and in San Francisco in that regard.
Yeah, I think that so the fair housing objections that have been raised around preferences have been around strictly distance from project site preferences. I currently live within half a mile, or whatever radius from a project site, and they're being seen as continuing segregative practices. You know, we could debate that. I don't necessarily agree in all contexts, but this does have some very different elements, and I think the actual neighborhood context means there's no neighborhood in Northeast Portland that is a majority black neighborhood. So we're not talking about a place of great racial segregation.
Even if you look at the city's condemnation, eminent domain, tax foreclosure records, there's not a emphasis on this is purely a one race that was targeted, but a geographic area that happened to be, at the time of these actions, one of the most racially diverse areas in the city of Portland.
I think it's also worth mentioning, although we've not asked nor received a HUD approval, we're using tax increment financing for this proposal, which of course is generally generated locally through our tax base. Certainly the Department of Justice has jurisdiction, HUD has jurisdiction, and perhaps it's useful to note that on May 18th, Secretary Castro did have an internal webinar for his CPD staff where they actually highlighted the preference policy as an antidote or a mitigating factor in gentrifying neighborhoods. So we know that he shared this with his staff. We see that as a positive message.
So the next question is, what rental housing is tied to the waiting list? Is this any housing financed by the city, and how did you coordinate with the existing waiting list? So I'll go ahead and take the first swing at this one as well. The preference policy, the current policy of the city under the Northeast Housing Strategy is any rental housing or home ownership programs that are administered in North and Northeast Portland will utilize the preference policy. And what we've shared today is really the pilot, the first rollout of the preference policy with a $5 million allocation of home ownership funds. And that's a little bit of what Victoria spoke about. So we have, since the development of the housing strategy and since the development of the preference policy, issued a NOFA and awarded funds for several rental development projects in North and Northeast Portland, and they're in various stages of pre-development or permitting, and they haven't begun construction yet, but as they begin construction and come online, they too will use the preference policy, and there are city funds in those buildings, urban renewal funds primarily. The other major source of affordable rental development is the city offers a voluntary property tax exemption program that's locally known as the multi-program, and it's a program whereby providing 20% of units at affordability levels at either 80% or 60% AMI, a developer gets a full residential property tax exemption for 10 years. And the units that are sourced from that tax exemption program in North and Northeast Portland will also utilize the preference policy as they lease up. And similarly, the multis that have been approved since the development of the housing strategy and the preference policy are still in some phase of construction, and we haven't seen a full lease up, although we're preparing for one in 2017. Actually, we're preparing for several buildings in 2017. And I think the last piece is we've had a number of organizations, NGOs, or even some hospitals that do housing that have expressed interest in some form using the preference policy for some of their units in an attempt to better integrate their work with the North-Northeast strategy generally that has taken hold. And so we're helping provide some infrastructure and technical expertise as they move forward there. I think one open question before I tackle the waiting list question is the city is on the precipice of adopting a mandatory inclusionary housing program, and we're going to be having discussions on how and if the preference policy could also apply to the mandatory inclusionary housing program. Right now, the conversation is focused primarily on just the calibration of the mandatory inclusionary housing program. With respect to coordinating with existing waiting lists, the Portland Housing Bureau is not the public housing agency for the city of Portland or the surrounding area. That's another agency that's called Home Forward. And so we don't own or operate a lot of relatively very few, maybe one or two, although we may be increasingly in that space. And we've been very historically uninvolved in the marketing and leasing of those units, which I think will be changing in the months and years to come. But to that end, there's not a standing waiting list that we maintain for either homeownership programs or rental housing. And the waiting list that we had created, we had over 1,000 people apply for the homeownership program application round that Victoria spoke about. That list, because we didn't want to just source applicants generally, the materials and the outreach and the education around that application process was very focused on homeownership. And so while we have that list that we have sourced for homeownership, we will be sourcing another list entirely for those individuals that would be interested in affordable rental housing. The next question, is there racial preference or any discussion to attempt to include this? No. Next question, is the policy currently working with or considering incorporating a community land trust model to ensure permanent affordability? That is, so one of the, for the homeownership nonprofit providers, we have some providers that will simply provide down payment assistance and help you shop on the open market. Some that own land and they build homes on that land and then sell both the home and the land. And then there are some that do a form of a land trust through the Proud Ground. It's a local nonprofit that does a community land trust model, and so they are a part of our provider network, and they have received funds that are subject to the preference policy.
Yeah, I would say that the community land trust model has very mixed reception among the African American community in Portland, particularly in this area for those who were living in Northeast Portland for a long time, unable to purchase homes because redlining continued through into the 90s in Portland, Northeast Portland. And now to see the sort of massive increase in wealth and value of those properties, that there is a strong push to give access for those families to a traditional homeownership wealth building model. And so PCRI, which is the Black-led CDC, is very committed to that traditional homeownership model. And I think, I don't know, Bishop Holt, if you want to say that we have had a lot of conversations about that among the Community Oversight Committee and the kind of pros and cons.
True. It is a major discussion and concern that almost to the extent of insult, that the families who have been most impacted by displacement and now having an opportunity to return don't have the same possibility of taking advantage of what would have been afforded them had they not been as impacted. And so it is something to continue to think through in the process. My perspective personally is that owning 70% of something is better than owning 100% of nothing. And so having some ownership, having some continued access into affordability is just a good model. However, I do appreciate and understand the angst associated with the conversation.
The next question is a two-parter. One, do you foresee extending to rental, which, as we said, yes, indeed. And the second, has HUD weighed in on approving Section 8 wait lists for preferences?
I'll go ahead and cover the second aspect of that. The Housing Authority of Portland was created initially by the City of Portland in 1939, and it's important that you know that historically Portland had shipyards on the Columbia River, so that this particular neighborhood is actually within a quarter of a mile of some of what were formerly large marine employers. So the location efficiency was quite good. Housing Authority of Portland changed its name to Home Forward. They now operate countywide, although we do appoint the majority, the City Council here appoints the majority of their board members. They do have local preferences in place. As Matthew mentioned, they undertook the revitalization of Columbia Villa, which is now a branded New Columbia under the Hope 6 rubric. And residents at Columbia Villa had a right to return. The Housing Authority manages their own wait list, and they recently reopened it. And we, in the last month data, did not see the total roll-up, but their waiting list runs pretty close to 10,000 households. So they have multiple local preferences as a housing authority for different aspects of their program. They have largely transformed their entire public housing stock to a mixed income model. The only remaining public housing are what they call their 85 stories, and this is a collection of senior high-rises which collectively amount to 85 floors. There's about 15 of these properties scattered throughout the city. So they are methodically going about the renovation of these high-rises, which tend to be for elderly and disabled populations. They run their own wait list. We collaborate on things like fair market rents. The Housing Authority does provide supplemental funding, or the Housing Bureau, excuse me, does provide supplemental general fund funding to Home Forward to pay for culturally specific navigators so that households that have language barrier issues with Section 8 or housing choice voucher landlords can have someone broker a relationship and communicate in their native tongue with them as they make a housing selection. We continue to work with the Housing Authority on a very close working relationship, but right now they administer their own program separately from this one.
So the next question, will the nonprofit partners be able to leverage the city's funds with other federal funds?
Well, TIF is often leveraged with 4% low-income housing tax credits. As I mentioned, we have an annual budget of $153 million. Almost all of that is put out in the form of subordinated debt and equity. The Housing Bureau is also the land bank for the city of Portland, so we administer sites and provide those sites to nonprofits and to private companies that are equally invested in social equity and inclusion. So in our current pipeline, we have pretty close to 1,000 units. Nearly all of those involve 4% tax credits and will leverage whatever additional debt and equity that they can find.
Next question. I'm considering this project application to my city, where much of our historical wrongs are tied to areas that continue to be depressed and disinvested. What are your thoughts on applying this philosophy to address wrongs that are focused on buying or rehab loans in areas that aren't quote-unquote opportunity areas like Albina?
My thoughts are excellent. It's about time that the amount of energy and effort to address those who have been historically wronged be equal to the amount of energy and effort to wrong them. It wasn't accidental. It was very methodical. It was strategic. It was intentional. And throughout the history of our nation, not just in this city, but in every major city, all of the people who are under economically not at the same level, or who are underserved, or who are oppressed in one way or another, are usually targeted and impacted by most actions. And so it would be great that the amount of scrutiny and effort that's used to make sure that we're not doing things to violate would be equaled by the amount of scrutiny and effort, or I should say the amount of intention that went into creating the problem. So I would strongly encourage the use of this process. We've been very thorough, as you've heard, quite a bit of time, not only on the front end, but on the back end of how things are done, and then to put together a objective entity such as the Oversight Committee that's not vested by being employed by the city and has no other concern other than to see what has been promised come to pass would be a great move.
Yeah, I think that kind of process would uncover what specific tools, programming, etc., would be appropriate you know, if I rewind my mind to 2000 when the urban renewal area, this latest urban renewal area was designated, there could have been a very different set of investments made that would have targeted this historically disinvested community, that would have taken a racial justice lens, of course within the bounds of law, where one cannot have racially specific policies. And now in 2015, the Urban Renewal Agency, the Portland Development Commission, has actually sort of caught on to that notion that its continued spending on the economic development side needs to address displaced Black-owned businesses, employment opportunities, and through community benefits agreements, connecting people who live in or were displaced from Northeast Portland to specific kind of economic opportunities, jobs, etc. They're not as far along as the housing side is. They have an oversight committee which interacts with the Housing Bureau's oversight committee, sometimes tense interactions, because their investments have been so heavily tied to gentrification and displacement. They haven't been distributed in a racially equitable way. But I think there's, on that flip side of kind of economic development activities and more traditional community development activities in a low-income neighborhood can also be tied back to a conversation about restorative justice that addresses that history, recent and deeper history.
The other thing I would add is, I don't know obviously the character of your neighborhood or your community, but in some of the other places I've worked in, including South Central Los Angeles, Watts in particular, the way by which to mitigate some of the losses included community facilities, new high school in South Central, community cultural centers, correcting, and this is in large part through Lisa's point about small business, correcting the access to healthy food in the food desert phenomenon that is often afflicted in low-income areas, which keeps them down, right? I mean, the amenity levels aren't sufficient to attract new people to schools, and the investment in the schools may not be sufficient. So I think if you were to undertake a process like this, you would probably also find a litany of community assets that could be developed to help correct some of those issues.
Okay, so the next question is, do you know how many families would be eligible for this preference policy or could be eligible? So I think the first thing is everyone is eligible for the preference. It's just a matter of levels of preference. With respect to eminent domain and condemnation action, the number is more in the hundreds of households who had property taken. And so with regard to direct descendancy, it could be hundreds or even into the thousands for the children of people whose parents had their property taken. With respect to, I think the question is more, do you have a sense of the number of people that would qualify at higher versus lower levels of preference? It's the boundary of the area encompasses a number of census tracts with, thousands of households. And so realistically, you could expect that there would be thousands of individuals that would qualify at any particular point level. But we haven't done specific modeling on the numbers. The next question is, will households referred through the preference list still be subject to landlords' reasonable application screening procedures? I think I'll tackle this one in two ways. I think first, one challenge that we've been having with the pilot program, really the first rollout on the home ownership, is that there are a number of individuals who may not be immediately mortgage ready. And so we've been working very hard with our home ownership program staff and the nonprofit partners to build in the flexibility to work with families to get them mortgage ready, because the last thing we would want to do is to spend this time and energy and resource at the Bureau and with community partners and community members in reaching out to folks and giving them some who've, again, been subject to negative actions by government, and give them hope and faith that they may be treated differently, only to have them be turned away because at the point in time in which we happen to allocate the funds and accept applications, they weren't mortgage ready. I think there are still some challenges with that, but we're working through that. On the rental side, I think that's a great question. And, you know, there are a number of properties, buildings, and projects that we'll be directly financing. And so we have a lot more, I mean, I guess the short answer is yes, will be a supplemental screening criteria applied with respect to property managers when they're leasing up the units. With our direct financing, we've got a lot more leverage to talk with the property managers, to talk with the developers and the nonprofits that are building, to think through the impact of their screening criteria on just low-income people generally, but particularly folks that may have been marginalized and displaced. I think it's a little bit more of a challenge on the tax exemption side, and we've been trying to handle that one on a one-on-one negotiation. But a lot of these folks are not used to doing business with the city. There's a little bit more apprehension in modifying their screening criteria, and at this point, the state and city have not established a standard set of screening criteria for which all landlords must use when screening applicants.
The only other thing I would add is that tenant protections have emerged as the city's top legislative priority for the upcoming state legislative session. And the Speaker of the House, Tina Kotek, is actually from North Portland. She's already come out with a fairly strident agenda as it relates to tenant protections, which the City Council will take a position on December 6th. I think ideally we would move to a system whereby there would be one application fee for all rental properties in the city, so that landlords essentially would have one application and there would be one fee paid that would be acceptable and transferable for any other landlord. But we need some additional state statutes in place to correct some of the inequities in our state landlord-tenant laws before we can get there.
So the next question is, how many city staff are needed to operate the preference program? And is that cost also covered by tax increment financing? So I'll go ahead and tackle the second part first. Yes, it is covered by tax increment financing. The Housing Bureau is able to bill staff time related to specific initiatives and projects to the urban renewal district from which the work is happening. Moreover, we also have general funds and federal funds that help to just cover the general operations of the Bureau. Right now, I would say, I can't speak for the number of staff that are working in nonprofits on how to implement this with respect to their operations. The Housing Bureau has probably 2 program staff on the home ownership program that manage the programs, and they've had to shoulder some additional workload. We've brought on, at any given time, anywhere between 2 and 5 staff, either on a permanent basis or temporary basis, to manage the first round of applications. And I will say that it's probably with heavy workload. We're currently in the process of looking at what the staff load will be for rental housing, given that we'll have a number of buildings coming online simultaneously, and that we will likely need to increase our staffing as well as our own IT infrastructure to be able to handle what, at this point, we're anticipating will be thousands upon thousands of applications. How did you decide to include all urban renewal activity, even things in the early 2000s? Was the light rail seen by some as a neighborhood investment? The AFFH would seem to want transit investments in all neighborhoods.
Well, yes, the light rail is a community investment. It also was a significant factor in driving gentrification and opening North and Northeast Portland to new private market investment, and also to be seen by newcomers to Portland as a viable neighborhood to live in. So it's been, very much implicated, and there was a tremendous amount of community organizing around not only the 1990 Albina Community Plan, but also the light rail extension itself, which, as Matt mentioned before, also happened in concert with Hope 6 projects that were going to displace people, however, temporarily. Actually, the Hope 6 projects here, a lot of people moved back to those sites. But in concert, those were all activities that were clearly seen as potentially going to cause displacement. There was a lot of activism, and there were a number of promises made to mitigate against that displacement, to ensure that new affordable housing would be built. That just simply never happened. So, you know, that, yes, I agree, transit is an important component of AFFH, and I think that's why that logic now holds around this preference policy, which is making it possible for people to stay on or return to a neighborhood that now has tremendous connectivity into the rest of the city, has a major community college campus, you know, library access, several large employers, not just the Emmanuel Hospital site, but also a Kaiser Hospital site, industrial areas that still employ a large number of people by the river, and other kinds of amenities that we consider to be all part of that package of opportunity areas.
I think it's worth mentioning that the Housing Authority of Portland received tax increment as the entire local match for their Hope 6 project. So all of the local match for Columbia Villa came out of the interstate TIF district. So the interplay of the of light rail, the interstate URA, and Columbia Villa were all working sort of in concert with each other. And I must say that that will never be repeated in the city again, because the Anti-Displacement Coalition has, I think, with some merit, recognized of gentrification was accelerated by that transit improvement. So we now have areas that are much more skeptical about transit improvements, even though as a city we are well connected and have had rail in place for over 30 years.
The next question, how many applicants applied for the preference, and can new people apply on an ongoing basis? So I think I mentioned this before, 1,000 people applied. This first round was a closed round where the folks had to apply before a certain date to be considered to be eligible for this $5 million allocation. We'll have another allocation of home ownership funds, and we'll reopen it, but then it will close. And then with rental housing, we're currently thinking through, given the volume of both private and nonprofit development that will be coming online within a 2 to 4 year window, whether an open list or a closed list, or a closed list that opens with every new building would be best. And so we haven't quite made that decision yet. We have a couple of questions around short and long-term goals, metrics, monitoring, and whatnot. And so, I mean, with that, you know, built into, I think built into kind of your critical path of folks that are either becoming aware that they can apply, aware that the preference policy exists, aware that they can apply, the application process itself, and then each stage of the review, verification, and handoff to one of the nonprofit partners to work with. We're building in measures for tracking. The preference policy we see as a tool to get folks in the door who have experienced displacement at the hands of city urban renewal action. And the last thing we want to do is be successful at getting people in the door, only to have other barriers that we or our providers have created simply filter them out again. And so we've built in a lot of tracking measures and internal controls between the city and the providers to ensure that as folks move through the process, as folks may be deemed perhaps ineligible to get a mortgage in a 2 to 4 year window, or filtered out because of screening criteria, that the Bureau is involved in those decisions, is aware of why they're happening, and can modify policy or practice if we feel that there is a impact that on historically marginalized communities that is not merited. As far as whether we had goals for the number of applicants that we would reach, we did not have goals. We did not know. We certainly wanted to see a good distribution of applicants in each of the point cohorts, which we did, I feel, in this first round. Of the 1,000, we saw anywhere between 150 and 250 in each of the point cohorts, so there was a good spread. But beyond that, no.
I would add to that another thing that we're doing is contacting our applicants with surveys through various points in the process. The first survey that went out addressed questions around how difficult or easy the actual application was and sort of what the applicant's reception was upon talking to PHB staff and staff at the designated application sites. I would say that the feedback from that was overwhelmingly positive. The second survey that we sent out maybe last week even, as we're starting to connect the nonprofit providers to the applicants, and the survey questions around that are again sort of, how do you feel like you are being treated by PHB staff, nonprofit staff, how is the information session, et cetera, and we're still waiting for those to come back. But at the end of each of those surveys, there's always a section for applicants to comment on sort of what obstacles they faced and how we can continue to improve our system. And I would also say, as far as tracking, that's one of the main benefits of having the oversight committee, because we can always come to them with sort of the metrics that we are tracking, and they can ask us to track more or sort of point out where we can have improvements.
So the last question we have on the list so far is, what is the range or average of the amount of money going to each family assisted? And so I'm assuming this is about home ownership. And I think this can maybe even give some context to the exacerbation of the housing crisis just in the last year or two. Traditionally, historically, in recent years, the subsidy average was about $10,000 to $15,000 of subsidy per household in North and Northeast Portland. And in the last 18 months, we've had to rapidly increase that to about $80,000 per household in order to be able to compete in what is an exceedingly hot, particularly single-family housing market. And so there's a lot of rent pressures with respect to the multifamily rental market in Portland. The single-family is just as intense, and in less than 2 years, we've had to over triple the amount of subsidy in order for our nonprofits to be able to compete for either land or homes. So that's all the questions we have on our list.
Hey, this is Chris, SDs at NHC. We also had a question that was asking a little more about the Inclusive Communities Working Group that I wanted to answer. It referred to how a city might establish a chapter or branch of one of these working groups. Just to read it, the working group itself is actually a group of with national scope that Caitlin mentioned at the beginning, representing roughly 20 high-cost or rising-cost cities. We are wrapping up the sort of second year of that work of the group. We'll be wrapping that up in the summer of 2017, and we'll be looking at places that we may want to include in that, but we're also interested in places that are looking to do more of this inclusive communities work, and maybe it's at the local level, so we encourage folks to reach out to us. Caitlin would be the best contact there for that kind of work, and we'd like to discuss with folks, what they're interested in doing and how we might be helpful to that work. We don't have a particular agenda other than being a resource, perhaps a facilitator, or in some way to share some of the best practices that we've learned that folks are doing in different places around the country.
And yeah, I think this webinar is a great example of that, you know, we identified this Portland preference policy and restorative justice through the working group, and through our web series with Capital One, we're able to share it with a larger audience. So I want to say thanks to all of you for your attendance and your questions, and thanks again to our panelists. And then I would be remiss if I didn't say thank you to the Open Society Foundation, who sponsors our Inclusive Communities Working Group, and Capital One, who sponsors our webinar series. So our next webinar is going to be on November, let me go to the next slide, November 3rd, and we'll be talking about our paycheck to paycheck interactive database. So through our paycheck to paycheck database, you can create maps or charts like this, and we use data from the first quarter of 2016 to examine the gap between wages and housing costs for both renters and homeowners in 210 areas, metro areas across the country. And more details on our webinars, including registration links and resources from past webinars, can be found by clicking the webinars button on our events drop-down menu on NHC's homepage. And I will also say that this slide deck will be available on our website. I know you can't click that here link that's showing up on your screen, but you will be able to click it in the PowerPoint version.
All right, this is Chris. Again, I want to echo Caitlin's thanks to our panelists and to our sponsors. Really appreciate them taking time to share the great work in Portland. Again, we feel like this is work that we are interested in continuing to look at and present as it goes forward. I think it's really on the forefront of a lot of the topics that I said at the beginning that we are really concerned about. And I think there's a lot more to come in this area, both in terms of what Portland's going to hopefully do as this program continues, but as other places begin to grapple with this, with these issues of how to best respond to communities that have been systematically discriminated and disinvested over time. We want to make sure folks know about two upcoming events that you can participate in December. We're hosting back-to-back events to really make it kind of a two-for-one deal if you come to Washington, D.C. On December 13th, we're hosting the How Housing Matters Conference, which explores the collaboration between organizations working at the intersections of housing and health, housing and education, and housing and economic opportunity. This event is sponsored by MacArthur. It's free to attend, but registration is required. And the next day, we are hosting Solutions for Affordable Housing, which is sort of a national housing policy convening. We're looking at sort of best practices at the local level around some of the big key housing issues that the country is facing, but also in this kind of post-election environment. What does the election mean for some of the federal work, and how do we take some of these best practices around these issues and sort of lift that up into a federal housing policy agenda that the field might get around and embrace. There is a registration fee for this, and we hope folks will take a look. For one fee, you're really getting two conferences over 2 days, which we think is a great opportunity. And am I correct that the early bird rate is still in effect until tomorrow? So we hope you'll take advantage of the discount rates. Finally, if you're not already an NHC member, and one of the reasons for being a member is to both know about these events, but also to be able to participate in our convenings at a discounted rate, as well as to support the work we do, we hope you will take a look at joining. If you're not a member, we do offer folks a 3-month free membership to kind of trial and see if you think it's worth it before being asked to join. But our goal is to engage as many folks across the country in this affordable housing community development work in our membership. So thanks again for joining us. Thanks again to the folks in Portland for sharing their great work. And thanks to our sponsors for making this possible, and hope you have a great rest of your day.